Taoiseach, there are two further serious reports in the news media today pertaining to the continuing saga of the National Children's Hospital. One in the Irish Examiner headlined "Secret Plan to Manage Hospital Fallout," and the other in the Irish Times, "Hospital Overrun would have happened regardless," referencing a confidential report prepared by the HSE, having been asked to do so by the Department of Health. The minutes of the Joint Construction and Finance Subcommittee of the National Paediatric Hospital Development Board on August 30 are particularly revealing, because they do show significant unease and concern about escalating costs and also significant efforts to keep the news under wraps, to have about 25 members sign confidentiality clauses and so on. Now, that meeting took place 3 days after the Minister for Health was told of a potential overspend of 391 million. And one wonders, did this overall secrecy feed in to the misleading of the Dáil in terms of Deputy Barry Cowan's parliamentary question and the answer he got, which was, as we now know, not the correct answer. And the whole emphasis at these meetings, there was a meeting took place, this describes a meeting with a PR agency to discuss the communications fallout around the overspend. It says the meeting was held on two scenarios with Q4PR. Award Phase B contract to BAM. 2, don't award and go with Plan B. And then JP noted a paper was issued and Butler agreed on some actions required. That's quite extraordinary that that level of engagement with the PR company in terms of whether we award the contract or essentially re-tender and go back to Plan B. And it seems to me, Taoiseach, that two issues emerge. One, in terms of the secrecy, one of those 25 people is the procurement officer, the top civil servant procurement officer in our civil service. We know that there's a code there, that he is obliged to report to the Minister, particularly where there are serious weaknesses in controls that have not been addressed despite being drawn to the attention of the board or the chairperson, and that there is an obligation, particularly in a non-commercial state body, to provide that material to the Minister of the day. And secondly, Taoiseach, it seems that the main message emanating here is that government's focus was on controlling the message, not the cost. Whatever else we do, we'll control the message around the overspend. There's no real focus on getting the costs down here. And it is quite extraordinary. When you look at all of the photographs, the videos around the National Children's Hospital, the government was good on the hard hats, it was good on the yellow vests, it was good on the videos, YouTube, you name it. There was no lack of communications around this hospital, right from the get-go. It's almost as if get the project started. It was even started without the detailed design being worked out. Get it on the ground, get boots on the ground, get it working from the public relations perspective. But that rendered you, Taoiseach, very vulnerable when it came to costs and when it came to really taking a hard line in terms of cost management and control around this particular project. So I'll ask you, Taoiseach, is it still the government's position that the Chief Procurement Officer did not discuss or alert senior officials in the Department of Public Expenditure about this overrun until November, notwithstanding what was going on around August? And can you rule out that the confidentiality around this was not a factor in the Minister misleading the Dáil last September? And will you confirm that all documentation and reports pertaining to this issue will be made public once and for all, and that this drip feed of information is stopped?
Taoiseach.
Thanks, Deputies. I understand that the minutes you referred to are either minutes from committees that met at official level or minutes of the National Paediatric Hospital Development Board, many of which were made available to the Public Accounts Committee and other committees many weeks ago. And the National Paediatric Hospital Development Board is an agency which was established by these Oireachtas and empowered and given the statutory responsibility to design, build and equip the Children's Hospital. There are no politicians on that board or any of those committees, and there are no political advisors on any of those boards or any of those committees. So I think, once again, this sounds like one of your conspiracy theories, Deputy Martin. There were no politicians nor political advisors on this board or any of those committees. And if the National Paediatric Hospital Development Board had a PR or communications plan to explain the increased cost of the Children's Hospital, they didn't do a very good job of doing it, quite frankly, and I think we'd all agree on that, given that it was not explained or communicated very well, either to government or to the public thereafter. I understand that one of the reports from the meetings indicates that the increased costs were inevitable. That is yet to be determined. The PwC report currently underway may well answer that question, but I think it is probable that what has happened here is that the cost of building this project, this massive hospital, this very complex development, was underestimated. So this is not a case of taxpayers' money being wasted. In fact, the vast majority of the money has not even been spent. Less than 20% of the project cost has been spent so far. But this is a case of the real cost of the project being underestimated. We have seen examples of that in the past with other major infrastructure projects, although not in the last decade. In relation to Mr. Paul Quinn was appointed by the Minister for Health to the National Paediatric Hospital Development Board. He does not represent either the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform or the Office of the Government Procurement on that board. He was appointed because of his procurement expertise. If he were to move to another role in another department or another employment outside of the public sector, he would have continued to be on the board, and that is still the case. Members of the National Paediatric Hospital Development Board, in line with the Code of Practice for the Governance of State Bodies and the Board's own Code of Governance, which is published on its website, have a duty to the Board in the first instance, a responsibility to act collectively in decision-making and communication, and an obligation to observe its confidentiality arrangements. You can print out from their website, page 51, the Code of Conduct for board members of the National Paediatric Hospital Development Board, and point 15 is confidentiality. Reports, documents and briefings. Count Corley, it is a recurring feature that when opposition members put out a yarn and their yarn. Count Corley, please. Count Corley, it's a recurrent feature. It's a recurrent feature that when the opposition in this House put out a yarn, perpetuated for days in the media, and when they're about to be found out, they shout you down. But I'll come back on the supplementary.
Deputy Martin. Please,
Taoiseach, you're correct. The politicians weren't on the board at the Paediatric Development Board. They weren't in the subcommittees, but they were in all the photographs. They were in all the videos. They were in every communication presentation on this hospital. This was the centrepiece of the National Development Plan. And therein lies the problem, I think. Because you said, to hell with the costs. Let's get the good story out. And let's get it out fast. And Taoiseach, when you're talking about yarns, Taoiseach, the only biggest yarn we heard in the last 3 years was in 2016 when you as Minister for Health said it's 650 million all in. It's now 1.7 billion and climbing. Don't talk to anybody here about yarns, Taoiseach, because people are quite frankly fed up with the yarns and fed up with the public relations, fed up with the spin. They want substance and they want facts, Taoiseach, and precision. And I would make the point to you in terms of Paul Quinn. You referenced his name, the Chief Procurement Officer. Your defence or your response is simply not tenable. It's driving a coach and four through Circular 12 210 here, Taoiseach, Protocol for Civil Servants nominated to boards of non-commercial state bodies. Where there's a significant public policy issue at stake or a disagreement within the board of major public policy issue, civil servants should request the chairman to notify the relevant minister, or failing that, the minister himself or herself. Where there are serious weaknesses in controls that have not been addressed despite being drawn to the attention of the board or the chairperson. We're talking about a 391 million overspend being alerted last August, and it is the government's position that the Chief Procurement Officer, who is a civil servant and whose loyalty is to the government and to the state and to the taxpayer, is somehow prevented from telling his line minister, who is responsible for the overall expenditure of the state, the facts around the alarming growth in expenditure in this project. I don't think that's a tenable response, Taoiseach.
Deputy, it is a yarn, and it's your spin, and it's yet another conspiracy theory from the leader of Fianna Fáil. Roughly this time last year, the Government published and approved Project Ireland 2040, a €116 billion 10-year capital development plan. Do you not think if we didn't know this time last year that the project was going to cost €1.4 billion, we wouldn't have accounted for it? €1.4 billion out of €116 billion. Little over 1% of the total cost of that project. Of course, if we'd known that this project was going to cost more, we would have accounted for it a year ago. Members of the National Paediatric Hospital Development Board, in line with the Code of Practice for the Governance of State Bodies and the Board's own Code of Governance available on their website, have a duty to the Board in the first instance, a responsibility to act collectively in decision-making and communication, and an obligation to observe its confidentiality arrangements. Mr Quinn serves on the Board in a personal capacity. Circular 12/2010, which deals with the protocol for civil servants nominated to the boards of non-commercial state bodies, does apply to civil servants serving on state boards, as comprehended by the Code of Practice for State Bodies in Section 3.4. The circular sets out the process by which a civil servant may bring the concerns to the attention of the relevant minister, who in this case would have been the Minister for Health. The process applies where a civil servant has concerns at a serious issue which is being not addressed to his or her satisfaction by the Board or the Board Chairman. I understand Mr Quinn was and is satisfied that the cost issues which developed over the summer and autumn of 2018 were being appropriately addressed by the Board, and the Chairman communicated both to the HSE and the Department of Health in a timely fashion through the governance arrangements established by the Department of Health as accountable department for the project. Under Circular 12/2010, Mr Quinn would have had to advise Minister Harris if he felt the serious matters were not being addressed by the Board, and communicated through Minister Harris's department. However, he felt that the matters being dealt with were being communicated, and the various minutes of the Board and the governance meetings bear that out. Therefore, he discharged his responsibilities under the circular.
Taoiseach, the time is up, please. Deputy Mary Lou MacDonald.